There are 298 prisoners on death row in the state of Florida. This is part 26 of the series. Richard Randolph, 61 years old, 34 years on death row. Minnie Ruth McCollum was murdered and Richard Randolph was found guilty and given the death penalty. Randolph used to work at a handy-way convenience shop in Peterka, which was run by Minnie Ruth McCollum. Witnesses Terry Sorrell, Dorothy Patilla, and Deborah Patilla saw Randolph shutting the front door of the handy-way convenience store on August 15, 1988, while he was wearing an employee shirt. Randolph was questioned by the women on the closure of the store and the whereabouts of McCollum. The women were informed by Randolph that McCollum had borrowed his vehicle since her own vehicle had broken down. He told the women that McCollum's car was fixed and that he was on his way to pick her up. He then walked out of the shop. The trash can was turned upside down and the women saw the counter was a mess. They reported the incident to the sheriff's office over the phone. After receiving the call, a deputy entered the establishment by smashing a window. The deputy discovered McCollum, who was still breathing and wailing, lying on her back with blood dripping from her head and neck. From the waist down, McCollum was also exposed. The deputy quickly ordered her to be sent to the hospital. A surgeon named Dr. Kirby Bland testified that McCollum was unconscious when arriving at the hospital. He discovered that she had endured a brutal beating and many blows to the head. McCollum's face, neck, and scalp all bore severe wounds. McCollum had a shattered jawbone. She also sustained stab wounds close to her left eye and a knife wound to the side of her neck. 6 days after the tragedy, McCollum passed away from the severe head injuries. Richard Shear, 57 years old, 34 years on death row. For the murder of Drew Snyder, Richard Shear was found guilty and given the death penalty. In December 1987, the victim, Drew Snyder, was reported missing. On January 13, 1988, Richard Shear was approached by authorities as part of their investigation into Snyder's disappearance. Snyder was a friend of Shear. He waived his rights to an attorney, talked to the police about the murder, and led them to multiple areas where Drew Snyder was killed. Daniel Peterka, 56 years old, 33 years on death row. Daniel John Peterka was due to turn himself in to Nebraska authorities on February 11, 1989, to start serving 2 consecutive one-year jail terms for theft. Peterka told his fiancée at the time that he did not want to go to jail and that he wanted to get a job and start over someplace else prior to turning himself in. In late February 1989, Peterka made an appearance in Niceville, Florida. He moved in with Ronald LeCompte. The former bought Peterka a gun. Peterka and John Russell shared a duplex when they moved in April 1989. The two, according to witnesses, did not get along well. Peterka showed up at Thompson's place of business that evening, driving Russell's vehicle. He invited Thompson to a restaurant and stated that he was on the run and did not want to go to jail. Francis Thompson spent the night at the duplex before departing the following morning for work. On July 13, 1989, Russell skipped work that morning. Around 9 a.m., a coworker named Gary Johnson visited the duplex and reported seeing Russell's car in the driveway. When no one answered the door, the coworker was worried about Russell and allowed himself in through a window. When he found the gun, he noted that it was unloaded and that the couch's cushions were missing. After work, he came back and questioned Peterka regarding Russell. Peterka said that Russell had departed with someone the previous evening, but he denied knowing where he was now. Eventually, Peterka did admit to the crime. Police were contacted by Peterka, who admitted to forging Russell's signature on a money order and paying Russell $100 to use his identity. Russell began pushing Peterka while talking about the money order, and the two eventually got into a brawl in the living room. Peterka won as they both reached for the gun. Russell was inadvertently shot in the top of the head by the gun as he stood up from the couch. Russell was buried in a shallow grave after Peterka wrapped his body in a rug and took him to a remote area of the Eglin Air Force Base. Jesse Guardado, 61 years old, 18 years on death row. He was given the death penalty for the robbery murder of a political and community leader who had attempted to assist him in getting back on his feet after being released from prison. He received a sentence from Judge Kelvin Wells for the beating and stabbing death of 75-year-old Jackie Malone at her house. In order to use the woman's money to purchase crack cocaine, he killed her in September 2004. Guardado assaulted the victim with a metal rod while she struggled for her life. When she didn't pass away, he stabbed her with a kitchen knife and slit her throat. The killer strike was a heart stabbing. Gary Lawrence, 66 years old, 28 years on death row. Soon after getting married, Brenda and Gary Lawrence parted ways. Brenda and her daughters, Kimberly and Stephanie Pitts, together with Stephanie's friend Rachel Mayton, welcomed Michael Finken into their home. Gary and Michael drove Brenda to work on July 28, 1994, the day of the murder, and then they had a beer at a friend's house. Brenda was picked up by Gary and Michael after she left the office so they could take her back to their friend's place and continue drinking beer. When Gary arrived back to Brenda's apartment, he found Michael sleeping with Brenda and they got into a fight and Gary punched Michael. They eventually appeared to have settled their argument and Michael fell asleep on the couch. Brenda ran about the home gathering weapons, including a pipe and a baseball bat, not long after she and Gary finished talking. In their words to Rachel and Kimberly, Brenda and Gary were going to knock off Mike. Kimberly was also instructed by Gary to stay inside the bedroom no matter what she heard. Rachel and Kimberly reported hearing a hammering noise in their bedroom. According to Rachel, she overheard the victim say, "Stop it, if you stop I'll leave." The victim allegedly repeated this claim multiple times according to her. As reported by Kimberly, the victim added, "Please don't hit me, I'm already bleeding." The girls were made to assist in cleaning up the area around the victim after the loud hammering stopped. Both girls testified about the victim's face being cut off throughout the trial. The victim was alive despite the beatings. Kimberly reported seeing Brenda, her mother, emerge from the kitchen with what seemed to be a dagger. Then, though Kimberly was unaware of what her mother was holding at the moment, she saw her make a stabbing motion in the direction of the victim. Brenda then requested that the girls go ask Chris Weatherby for assistance. Chris entered the flat and found the victim's skull shattered, his face unrecognizable, and the mop handle jammed down his throat. Gary kicked the victim after Chris asked him what was going on, stating, "This is what's going on." Chris heard the guy take 3 or 4 ragged breaths after the mop handle was taken out of his throat. Then the man stopped breathing and passed away. Gary told Chris that after beating the victim with a pipe until it bent, he then beat him with a baseball bat. The victim's pockets contained a little amount of cash that Gary and Brenda stole. The body was then placed in the victim's car after being covered in a shower curtain. Gary took the car to a remote location where he lit the body on fire. Brenda and Gary danced when Gary entered the flat. Later that day, Gary was pulled over while operating the victim's vehicle. Gary admitted to the killing and said he attacked the victim because Brenda and the victim had been having a relationship. The victim's death was attributed to blunt force trauma and possibly asphyxia, according to the medical examiner's testimony during the trial. He added that when the mop handle was rammed into the victim's throat, he was still conscious. Given that the victim's blood alcohol level was quite high, it was possible that one or more of the hits to the head could have resulted in unconsciousness. George Trepel, 74 years old, 32 years on death row. George James Trepel was given the death penalty by the court for killing Peggy Carr. After consuming Coca-Cola from a tainted bottle that contained thallium nitrate, Peggy Carr became ill. Pesticides containing the hazardous ingredient thallium were outlawed in 1965. The compound is, nonetheless, extensively employed in the chemical production of methamphetamine. The same toxin also poisoned further Carr family members, but they lived. Investigators went undercover in search of information, and one of them had George James Trepel, Carr's neighbor, as his primary suspect. Trepel moved out a year later, and only then did the police search his house. An old bottle of thallium left behind in Trepel's garage was the case's missing piece, which the detectives were able to find. Robert Rimmer, 56 years old, 32 years on death row. Aaron Knight and Bradley Krause were killed on May 2, 1998 during a heist at an audiologic business in Wilton Manors, and Rimmer was found guilty of their murders. The victims were shot from point-blank range in a brutal manner. Rimmer and Kevin Parker entered the Audiologic store in Wilton Manors, Florida, probably with the help of a third person. Bradley Krause and Aaron Knight were the two employees that were working that night. Rimmer and Parker instructed the two workers to lie face down on the ground before taping their hands together. Rimmer had a semi-automatic weapon at his disposal. 11 offenses, including a first-degree murder, armed robbery, armed kidnapping, attempted armed robbery, and aggravated assault, were brought against Parker and Robert Rimmer. Rimmer got the death penalty, and Parker received a life sentence. Anton Krozak, 64 years old, 31 years on death row. David Stocker was robbed and killed at his house by Krozak and his co-defendant William "Billy" Poirer. In Lee County, Texas, in September 1990, Stocker was choked by Krozak while Poirer kept his mouth and nostrils closed to prevent him from breathing. For around 10 minutes, Krozak choked Stocker before pouring drain cleaner and water down his mouth. Then Poirer tapped a washcloth inside Stocker's mouth. Stocker was placed in the bathtub as his ankles were shackled together by Krozak. They took over Stocker's pickup truck and loaded it with audio gear, 2 television sets, 5 rifles, a video recorder, and a revolver. On their way out to sell the stolen goods, they also loaded Stocker's body into the truck. His body was transferred to their car, which was parked down the street after they finished their appointment with the buyers. They proceeded to transport the body to a remote area in Charlotte County that Krozak had already scouted. For second-degree murder and robbery, Poirer received sentences of 35 years and 15 years respectively. Harry Jones, 64 years old, 31 years on death row. For a robbery and a murder, the state of Florida gave Jones a death sentence. Court records say that Harry Jones killed George Wilson Young Jr. in order to take his car. According to the medical examiner, Young drowned in fresh water, which is the cause of death. Young was alive when he was submerged, even though the medical examiner was unable to identify whether or not he was awake at the time he drowned due to plant matter that had become stuck in his neck and lungs. In addition to other wounds, the medical examiner found that Young had many shattered ribs and a fractured arm, which were consistent with pre-mortem defense wounds. Please hit that subscribe button if you like my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.